So I'm going to rough out a leaf real quick, and the technique for the leaf that I'm going to use is very similar to the technique for the apple itself. I'm just going to start off with a cube, and the cube is going to be, I'm really thinking about a top-down profile shape for a leaf. So this is, you know, this whole notion of box modeling, starting off with a real simple piece of geometry, and bumping up the segmentation. In this case, I'm going to push the segmentation back along the z-axis, just based on the way that I have this shape made. I'm going to leave it a little big relative to the apple, but I have it, you know, in the neighborhood of the scale that I want to use. Maybe I'll even bump that segmentation up just a little bit higher. I also want, eventually, I probably want some control along what I'm thinking of as the width of this leaf, but I'll do that a little bit later. I will bump up one segment here in the center, just so that I have a control kind of down the center of this object. Slightly different technique here. What I'll end up doing is I could use that loop selection technique that I used before, but my goal here is just to make this editable. I'm going to go into direct select, or excuse me, live select with, I'm just going to manually, I'm shift clicking and selecting these points. Not a bad idea to get used to being able to navigate and make manual selections. I'm going to go into scale, and by scaling I'm just kind of sending those points all towards, all towards the same point. Now I could throw a little variation on this, andLl just zoom in really close so you can see this. If I scale these according to all three axes, you can see that vertically they're scaling as well. So they're scaling vertically and horizontally, and that's why this is starting to pinch in here. If I Command Z to back up, if I scale this only according to one axis, you can see that they just scale towards the point in line with that axis. So that'll be the technique that I use here. And really what I'm trying to do is I'll just jump into my tools, my doodle tool, and really what I want to do is I just want to kind of create the basic shape of a leaf here. And I'll attach it to the stem. That's the idea here, and then you know, just kind of like a rough leaf shape. So I'm thinking about what the shape of that leaf should be, and I'll rough out something that I think makes sense. So I'll just try a loop selection here. I lost my selection on my cube, so I'm going to make sure my cube is selected in point mode. And I'll do the UL technique to select all of those points. Now when I scale this time around, I'm actually going to restrict its scaling to one axis. Okay, so depending on how I select things and how I scale things, I'm going to get different results. And that's more or less the shape that I'm going for. Okay, so I'm pretty happy with that. Maybe I'll select a loop right down the center, and if I just kind of move that down, I can start to, you know, create a little concaved effect. But you can see I'm starting to tear my geometry over here. Now, let's say that I actually wanted more geometry in this, and I've been modeling it for a little while now, and I realized, oh, I really want more control, and I wish I would have added some segmentation along the x-axis here, so I had more points in here. Well, I always have the option to go in and I can cut objects with the knife tool. And to demonstrate this point, I'll just jump out really quickly. I'll create a cube. I'm going to make it editable. I'll change my display really quickly to a display with lines so you can see this a little bit more clearly. Now, if I'm modeling this cube and I've already converted it, made it editable, it's no longer a parametric primitive, so I can go in and I can grab the points and do some other things and you know, kind of stretch around. If I decide that I need more segmentation here, I can always go in and add it after the fact. And I can do that using tools like the knife tool. And I can find that under the mesh. I'm looking for create knife. And once I have the knife tool selected, what I can do is I can click and drag, and you can see that I can attach two edges. Now, I've just cut some segmentation into the object. Now, the thing that you need to be careful with is that we always want our mesh balanced. So whenever we're using this tool and we're cutting in new geometry, it's important that if I cut these surfaces and I cut that surface in half, it's important that I continue this line all the way around the object to kind of close this loop that I've created, okay? Because otherwise, what we have is we have this geometry, this surface, this polygon surface exists, and it's based on 4 edge points. We always want our geometry based on 4 edge points, and by leaving this face open, what we've done, I'll just go into edge mode, is that we've made a surface now that requires 6 points on the backside to create that polygon, and we're going to get really crazy results within our mesh if we don't fix that. And so we can fix that very simply by just cutting all the way around the object. Now there's some tools that make this a little bit easier, and there's some different ways that we can use the knife tool. Currently with the knife tool selected, if I go to Mesh, Create, and I choose that knife tool, the mode that I'm working in currently is in line mode, okay, which means that if I just drag across an object, and in fact I can cut across, it's just a line, and whatever falls within that line ends up getting cut. I can also turn on visible only, or excuse me, turn off visible only, and the idea here is that if I flatten out my view and I cut through an object, you can see now that I've cut all the way around or all the way through the object. In addition to that, I'll turn that back on. The mode of the knife tool I can also set to loop, and this is probably one of the best ways to use the knife tool. So if I want to cut this object in half, what I can do is just roll my knife, and it's going to create a loop perpendicular to the edge that we have selected. So you can see I'm selecting a horizontal edge, therefore my loop is looping around the object. If I select a vertical edge, it's making a perpendicular selection. So I'll just click one time, and you can see now that I have some geometry inside the equation, so I've just made that cube much more complex. And it may still be an abstract concept about when you need more geometry, or how to get started, and it's okay if you don't hit it right on the head the first time. I'm going to use this loop tool, and it's very important that when you're using loop selections or tools or trying to modify the geometry, I mentioned before that Cinema 4D either likes everything selected or nothing selected, and right now I have some points selected, and so whatever tool I select can only affect those points. So what I need to do is I need to deselect to make sure that that's not selected. I'll go to the Mesh tool, Create, and I'll bring up Knife. And so now, when I roll over an edge, I can actually start to cut edges. Now, I want to work in that same mode that I was working in before, so with the Knife tool selected, if I go to the Attributes Manager and change it from Line Mode to Loop, you can see that if I select one of these horizontal edges here, I'm cutting a loop all the way around the surface of my object. And if I remember how this object was originally a cube, it should kind of make some sense here that when I select that object, I now have more geometry on that side of the cube. I'll roll my mouse over here, and I'll cut in, and so now I have more geometry that I can play with. And so at this point, what I'll do is I'll just go back into my loop selection, and I'll select a few of these points, and I'll just kind of move that down a little bit. I'm getting to the point where my model's getting a little more complex, and so I'll just go in and do a quick manual selection. And it's supposed to be kind of an organic object, so it's okay if some of these are, you know, a little off, a little wonky, but if I just kind of pick that up, you can see that I'm starting to deform the surface a little bit. Maybe I'll even go to rotate and just kind of change some angles here and kind of move stuff around. But you can see that I'm starting to create a fairly irregular shape, and very quickly I'm getting that leaf shape that I was looking for. Just kind of pick up those. So there we go. I'm pretty satisfied with that. I'm not going to overwork this because I don't want to spend too much time playing around with this. But I'm fairly satisfied with that. I think the only thing that I need to do is I really want a curve running this way along the object. So I'm going to use the loop selection and select all the way around the object, and I'll just start to move some of these points. I'll move those points down. I think I'll have better luck if I zoom way in here, and I'll select all these little endpoints here and see how complex my geometry is starting to get. Oops, I just lost my selection. After all that hard work, I lost my selection. There we go. And I'll move that down. Okay, so you can start to see I'm starting to get that curve that I was looking for. And again, that's the beauty of this loop selection, is I can just find an edge. And as long as my mesh is balanced, I can just get in there and make a quick selection. I'm going to be a little suspicious of this edge, the way that it's looking. I don't think I'll be able to make a real clean selection with the loop, or if I do, I'm not even sure what I'll be looking at, so I'll just make kind of a more precise selection. There we go. I'll push that down. Now normally I'd probably clean up something like this, but you know, it does look kind of organic, and it is going to be hidden by the stem ultimately. So there's my leaf shape starting with a cube. I'm pretty satisfied with that. I think it's going to go a long way to help this apple look a little bit more convincing. Just kind of stick that maybe right about there. If it feels big, I could scale that. I could rotate it. You know, I'll really just kind of change its position to make it look like it makes a little bit more sense. I'll just, for the sake of the demo, I'll slap a real simple dark green texture on it. Don't mind the fact that it's got a really hot specular on it. There we go. There's my apple. I'm pretty satisfied with that. Again, I'll continue to tweak this a bit, but I'm going to group all this stuff. I'm going to call that group apple. And I'll copy and paste this back into my original desk scene. I'll get rid of that original cylinder reference, and I'll throw my apple in. And because I modeled it, it's roughly to the scale I want. Now looking at it, I can say, that feels a little small. I like my apples to, you know, I'll make my genetically modified apple here. My mutant apple will be nice and large. Lots of good fertilizer has been spent to make this apple the size of a cantaloupe. And so it's inside the scene. Now I have something I can start to work with. I got a couple of objects inside my scene. I'll give that a quick render, and now I can start to think in terms a little bit more about the lighting and some of the effects of the rest of the environment. So in the next presentation, we'll take a look, we'll make a quick pass at the environment and some lighting, and then we'll push forward and talk about modeling some more objects inside our scene, but we'll do that in the next presentation.